Hi, I'm Matt, and you're watching Badly Editing. Ever since the Bourne Supremacy in 2004, the shaky cam and fast edit style of action scenes has become the norm, and it's actually evolved the cinematic language quite a bit. But the problem is, most of the fight scenes that do this since the Bourne Supremacy are hyper edited and just incoherent messes. The 2018 reboot of Tomb Raider is one such movie that is a mess in terms of its action editing. I think by studying a poorly edited action scene, we can actually learn a lot. So I'm going to break down the way Tomb Raider introduces Lara Croft. I think this scene is worth talking about because it fails both narratively and technically. And both of these failures are things that I think could be fixed in the editing process. The entire scene is only 70 seconds long, so I'm not going to give you any context and I'm just going to play it for you guys. Alright, let's watch Tomb Raider.
You've got to make decisions, Lara. You've got to make something happen. Counter punching doesn't work for you. You don't have the skill.
Thanks, Terry.
You're welcome.
Come on, Laura!
Stop dancing, start fighting.
Let's go! Come on. Nice one, Laura! You've got this!
It's over.
Isn't...
Then get out of it.
Come on, Laura, tap out!
Alright, if you were anything like me, you thought that this scene was impossible to follow. And you're even more confused because this is our grand introduction to Lara Croft. I think I do understand what the filmmaker was going for on a narrative level and on a thematic level. And I'll get into that, but before we do, I hate to do this to you guys, but let's watch this scene again. This time though, let's keep track of every time there's a cut.
You've got to make decisions, Lara. You've got to make something happen. Counter punching doesn't work for you. You don't have the skill.
Thanks, Terry.
You're welcome.
Come on, Laura!
Stop dancing, start fighting.
Let's go! Come on! Nice one, Laura! You've got this!
It's over.
Isn't...
Then get out of it.
Come on, Laura, tap out!
To help frame this discussion, I'm going to discuss some common rules of editing. But before I do, I just want to say this. Filmmaking is subjective, filmmaking is artistic, and editing, above all else, is an emotional process. So when I bring up the following rules, it's important to remember the words of Captain Barbossa.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
So if you're an editor, a filmmaker, or just somebody who likes how movies are made, know that these rules were made to be broken. But like any good rule, you have to understand it before you break it. Rule number 1, give us faces and reaction shots. This is our introduction to Lara Croft. This is the only close-up of her face in the entire scene and it lasts half a second. We never get another good shot of her face. If you didn't know who Tomb Raider was, if you literally just sat down and watched this movie blind, you might not even think that she's the important character. One of the misconceptions I had a long time ago about action scenes was that they're emotionless, but the opposite is actually true. Think about it. If your characters are driven to the point where they're fighting, Clearly there is some kind of emotion that has driven them to this point where conflict is the only way to resolve it. So in this scene, we actually have no idea what the emotional stakes are. And part of the reason we don't know is because we never see Lara's face. Not really, anyway. So if we can't see her face, then we don't know how she feels about this fight, and if we don't know how she feels about the fight, then we don't know why it's important. The story of this scene, I think, is that Lara is trying to prove her trainer wrong by winning the fight. But how would audiences know that? Those few lines of dialogue indicate that her trainer doesn't think very highly of her.
Counter-punching doesn't work for you. You don't have the skill.
Thanks, Terry.
But in those shots, we see more of his face than hers. By that logic, the most important person in the sequence isn't Lara, it's her trainer. As I said, there are no good shots of Lara's face in the entire scene, and it makes the thing hollow. The only time we get any emotion is at the end of the fight, when Lara has lost and is angry at the result. But instead of seeing her face and getting a good look at her frustration and anger, this is what we get instead. She's lying on the ground, staring at the floor. The only way she conveys emotion is by slamming the ground and shouting out loud. And that might perhaps convey the emotion effectively, if not for, well, let's bring up rule number 2. Rule number 2, let your shots breathe. So the shot we're talking about is Lara hitting the ground in frustration at the end of the fight, but it cuts before she actually hits the ground. The camera doesn't linger, so we don't get to wallow in that emotional state at all. If it's cutting so fast, then maybe we're trying to get quickly to something more relevant. But this is the literal next shot. It cuts to a shot of Lara tying her shoes. There's nothing interesting about this. All it has done is convey a passage of time. When discussing rule number 1, I talked about how this scene has no emotion, and the editing is part of the reason why. A rule of thumb in editing is that the more complex the emotion on screen is, the longer you let it sit there. I think this scene from Skyfall is a good example of what I'm talking about.
Medical evaluation, fail. Physical evaluation, fail. Psychological evaluation, alcohol and substance addiction indicated. Oof. Pathological rejection of authority based on unresolved childhood trauma.
So, imagine, Lara has just lost this fight. It was a knockout, drag-out fight and she got her ass kicked. She's lying there on the ground, frustrated, out of breath, and defeated. She hits the ground in anger. But instead of cutting, the camera just lingers for a moment. Imagine how much more powerful that scene would be if we hadn't immediately cut to something that is of literally no consequence. This edit undercuts any emotion in the scene, but most of the editing in the scene actually does something worse. For a fight scene where we're meant to be really caught up in the moment, the editing actually undercuts every physical moment in the scene. If each shot is less than a second long, audiences can't orient themselves in the scene at all. When you edit so much like this, you end up disregarding any visual continuity. Like this shot here. In shot 6, Lara is flung into the corner. Her head snaps back and then reactively snaps forward again. In shot 7, we begin this shot with her head flung backwards and still snapping forward. So shot 7 starts already even though shot 6 has just covered this exact moment. This was 2 shots when it could have been 1, and we actually just repeated ourselves. Or look at shots 48 to 51. It took the editor 4 separate shots to show Lara getting thrown to the ground. I mean, why? I can't think of a single reason not to let this be 1 or 2 shots maximum. There's no style or flair because the camera moves each time. But the worst thing about all the editing in the scene is that so many cuts happen right at the moment of impact from a kick or a punch. Like shots 21 and 22. The cut happens the moment her fist lands. Every time you edit on impact, it actually deflates the punch significantly. So yeah, there were too many edits in this scene. The action became redundant. And I think part of the problem is that clearly they got a lot of coverage. They had shot this fight so many times that the editor had whatever shot they wanted to choose from. But having all that footage led to them breaking rule number 3. At the beginning of the video, I said that when it comes to filmmaking, sometimes the rules were meant to be broken. And if you want to talk about filmmaking rules that are meant to be broken, then look no further than the 180-degree rule. This rule is about preserving viewer orientation in a scene. It's done by keeping the camera and the edit restricted to one side of a conversation. So when two characters in a scene are doing anything in relation to one another, there's actually an imaginary line drawn between them, and the camera stays on one side of that line. Take this scene from Get Out, for example. Missy is always on the left side of the frame looking to the right. Chris, inversely, is always on the right side of the frame looking to the left. Between them, there's a line. And even here, when the camera is right in Chris's face, it never actually crosses the line. If Get Out had broken the 180-degree rule, then you'd get a jarring cut like this.
Now you're feeling very sleepy. We do use focal points sometimes to guide someone into a state of heightened suggestibility.
Heightened suggestibility.
That's right. That's right.
See how weird that is? The rule keeps us, the viewer, oriented and always able to follow the action. Whether it's two people talking, a car chase, a fight scene, the 180-degree rule is always a good one to keep in mind when it comes to your editing. But there are ways to break the rule. When Batman and the Joker meet in The Dark Knight, the camera crosses that imaginary line, thus breaking the 180-degree rule. But the disorientation that it creates actually supports the film. By this point in the story, the Joker has talked about his scars more than once, and it's never been the same story twice. So we know this character is untrustworthy, he's a liar, he's dangerous, and he's unpredictable. By breaking the rule, we're actually reinforcing all of these emotions. The camera moves and the edit keeps you guessing as to what's going to happen next. And sure enough, the power dynamics in the room do a complete 180, no pun intended, when the Joker reveals that he's taken Harvey and Rachel prisoner.
I have one rule. Oh, then that's the rule you have to break.
So when the filmmakers of The Dark Knight break the 180-degree rule, it's broken in service of the story. In Tomb Raider, it clearly wasn't. The editing in the fight from Tomb Raider seems always focused on using the best angle they shot. But by always using the best angle, they're going to end up putting in too many shots. Even the simplest moments in the fight now become unnecessary and confusing. Take shots 27 and 28. In shot 27, Lara gets pushed out of the picture to the right side of the frame, so that's where our eyes are focused. But in shot 28, Lara is in the middle of the frame, backing towards the left side. So our eyes actually have to move pretty quickly to get from the right side of the frame to the middle. Or take shots 45 and 46, where Lara is positioned again to the right side of the frame, but in the next shot, she's immediately coming from the left. The need to shift your gaze to follow the action may not sound like a lot, but when you're doing it literally every single second, you're gonna get tired and you're gonna stop paying close attention. And more importantly, you're bound to miss things. When John Seale shot Mad Max Fury Road, he talked about how director George Miller made him keep everything always in the center of the frame. By doing this, even if the shots were 1 or 2 seconds long, your eyes were already right where they needed to be. In Tomb Raider, the problem is that you're spending precious milliseconds shifting your gaze, and while you're shifting your gaze, the action is still happening and you're missing entire beats of the scene. So, if you're gonna have shots this fast, you need to respect the 180-degree rule. And that brings us to rule number 4. Make your characters easily identifiable. The two characters in this scene are both fit, light-skinned, brunette women wearing black sports bras. If they had been slightly different, and yes, I know one of them has longer hair and one of them has shorter hair, but if they'd been slightly different, maybe you could have broken the 180-degree rule and gotten away with it. But visually, they're so similar that you couldn't. Clarity in an action scene is one of the most important things you can do. We need to immediately know who is who, and know that at all times. If Lara had been wearing a different outfit, perhaps a signature blue tank top, then at the very least, we'd be able to understand who is who, even if the fighting is fast and furious. Now, like all the rules we talked about, we could have broken this rule if we hadn't broken all the other ones as well. So maybe if we'd seen their faces, or the cuts were longer, or we kept the 180-degree rule respected, then maybe wardrobe wouldn't be an issue. But the editing in this scene, from a technical level, isn't as bad as what it's doing on a narrative level. This is a bad introduction for your character. After 20 years, 2 previous movies, over a dozen video games, audiences know who Tomb Raider is. She was crudely conceived of as, quote, Indiana Jones with boobs, but over the years, she's developed into an action heroine who is confident, athletic, resilient, and curious. And the filmmakers know that we know this, so they're doing something smart actually. They clearly intend to subvert our expectations. Lara Croft isn't going to start this film as a Tomb Raider, but a scrappy, angry punk with a chip on her shoulder. And that sets up a good character arc. But again, this is our first shot of Lara Croft. Really, the entire boxing scene should have just been cut. The following bike chase was actually a better character introduction. See, before the chase, we get to learn a little bit about Lara. She's working as a bike messenger, she's headstrong, athletic, a bit cocky, and she's really eager to prove how independent she is. So she agrees to take part in an illegal street race. But the race ends up getting busted by the police, and her former guardian has to come bail her out of jail. And in the conversation between Lara and Anna, we start to understand how Lara's father leaving made her into the kind of person who would have the personality traits we just saw. These scenes do a way better job of establishing who Lara is, as opposed to that boxing match where the one character trait we get, allegedly, is that she's indecisive. Now, compare this shot to this shot.
You lost today, kid. But it doesn't mean you have to like it.
See how much better that is? It's the exact same thing, but by having the hat be in the same spot in the frame, we've established continuity from the last scene, even though we've jumped forward 20 years. The music cue is solemn but heroic at the same time. And most importantly, we get to see his eyes. We get to see him crack a smile. We know exactly what's going on in his head. And then he gets punched in the face. So I think I understand what Tomb Raider was trying to set up, but the editing was so fast that it just can't work. So, to summarize, the edits never give us a good look at her face, the editing is too fast, making shots redundant or incoherent, the 180-degree rule is ignored, the characters on screen are indistinguishable from one another, and worst of all, this emotional character introduction has no emotion. But what would the scene look like if we hadn't broken all the rules? But before I wrap this up, I want to talk about the bathroom fight from Mission Impossible Fallout. It's a great action scene in the movie full of great action scenes. I wanted to talk about how Mission Impossible follows all the rules we just talked about, while Tomb Raider breaks those rules, and how as a result the Mission Impossible fight is a stronger one. So here's 70 seconds from the bathroom fight in Mission Impossible Fallout, starting from about where things start to pick up. Alright, let's discuss. Rule number 1, we get a lot of faces and a lot of reactions. There's an emotional journey that goes on in this scene. We get concern, shock, frustration, determination, rage, and concern that borders on fear. Hunt and Walker might actually lose this fight to Lark, and by giving us shots of their faces and reactions, we're emotionally invested. Rule number 2, there were fewer cuts, and actually there were on average more punches and kicks delivered per shot. Because I'm an obsessed madman and I thought the Tomb Raider scene was terrible, I went back and counted the number of kicks and punches in each scene to compare. In Tomb Raider, there were 19 kicks and punches thrown. In Mission Impossible Fallout, there were 42. There was actually double the violence in the scene, even though Fallout had fewer edits and more time between moments to let us read the emotions on the actor's face. As I said, the editing in Tomb Raider made things redundant. The fast editing made it seem like a lot was going on, but in reality, there was less action than in a comparable fight scene. And again, in Tomb Raider, the average shot was 0.94 seconds, where in Mission Impossible, the average shot was 1.5 seconds. So, rule number 3. They actually break the 180-degree rule in number 3. But because the shots are longer, the action isn't repetitive, and the framing is by and large better, we can break this rule, but it doesn't throw us off too much. So here's how the rule was broken in Tomb Raider, and here's how the rule was broken in Fallout. Clearly one was easier to distinguish than the other. A longer shot allows you to orient yourself and better keep track of what's happening. And by this point in the movie, we've already been in this bathroom for a minute or two, so we understand the geography better. Okay, rule number 4. Fallout has a similar conundrum to Tomb Raider actually. In Tomb Raider, both the women were wearing athletic gear because they're fighting. In Mission Impossible Fallout, the club that Hunt and Walker have to break into clearly has a dress code, so everybody in this scene is wearing a suit. But we can still distinguish who is who. For starters, Ethan Hunt is wearing a dark suit, white shirt, and no tie. Agent Walker has a gray tone suit, is wearing a tie, he's got the biggest physique, and he's rocking cinema's greatest mustache. And John Lark is Asian and wearing a gray 3-piece suit, and he's a bit shorter than the other two. Oh, and all of this is set in the bright white back room, so there's better contrast and everybody sticks out. Even if we didn't get good shots of their faces, we'd still know who is who, because we have black, dark gray, and light gray. It's a fantastic fight scene, and this is probably the greatest movie moment of 2018. So I hope this essay helped you better understand why editing in Tomb Raider was so bad. Action movies are my favorite genre of film, but we've seen more and more CGI and quick editing end up replacing good, old-fashioned long takes and well-rehearsed choreography. Anyway, this has been Badly Editing, and I want to thank you for watching. And always remember,
be excellent to each other.